The hostess' voice cut through the restaurant like a blade when she said there were no tables available. Not tonight. Not for walk-ins. Not even for a woman turning 80 years old. The elderly woman, with a small paper crown tilted on her silver hair, smiled politely, but her eyes betrayed her. This was the night she was supposed to prove to herself that she still mattered. As she quietly gathered her coat to leave, a single father seated nearby with his young son froze mid-bite. Something about the way she said thank you reminded him of the day his own mother had been turned away from a hospital waiting room years earlier. Before logic could intervene, he stood up and spoke words that would pull 3 lives onto a path none of them expected. He told the hostess that she was with him, that this table was hers, that his family would gladly make room. The room seemed to pause. The woman looked at him in disbelief, unsure whether to trust kindness anymore. But when the child tugged her sleeve and smiled up at her with unfiltered sincerity, she nodded, sat down slowly, and everything began to change. This man, named Daniel, was not wealthy or influential. He was a widowed warehouse worker raising his son alone, carrying exhaustion like a second spine, struggling to pay rent. He had brought his son out that evening not to celebrate, but to distract them both from the ache of another quiet birthday, one that belonged to a woman who had died too young. The elderly woman, whose name was Margaret, noticed the careful way Daniel cut his food smaller, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he winced when prices were mentioned. As conversation unfolded, Margaret shared that she had outlived everyone she once celebrated with her husband, her sisters, her closest friends. She had promised herself that if she reached 80, she would take herself somewhere nice, just once, to honor the girl she used to be who believed life would always include people at the table. Daniel listened with a quiet respect, and his son asked questions that only children ask, innocent and piercing. Margaret laughed for the first time that night, a sound she had forgotten belonged to her. As dessert arrived unplanned, Daniel realized he was watching something rare. Not joy without pain, but joy standing beside it without fear. When the bill arrived, his chest tightened. He had already stretched his budget too far, but before he could speak, Margaret reached for it with shaking fingers and said this one was hers, because birthdays should not be bargained over. Daniel hesitated, pride wrestling with gratitude, until she looked at him and said that letting someone give was also a form of kindness. That night they parted with a hug that felt heavier than it should have, because neither knew how deeply it would echo. Days later, when Daniel lost hours at work due to cutbacks and panic crept back into his bones, a handwritten note arrived at his door. It was an address and a simple message asking him to come for tea. When he did, he discovered that Margaret lived alone in a modest home filled with photographs and unfinished puzzles. She confessed that she had been waiting for an excuse to stop disappearing, and that something about him and his son had reminded her that family did not always come from blood, but from choice. Over the following weeks, an unexpected rhythm formed. Daniel fixed small things around the house in exchange for stories and meals. His son found a grandparent-shaped space he hadn't known he needed. Margaret found purpose again in cooking, listening, and showing up. Then one afternoon, as Margaret struggled to stand, she admitted through tears that her health was failing faster than she had shared. Daniel felt fear rise, not of loss, but of being unworthy of what was being offered. Margaret placed a folder in his hands, containing legal documents, including a trust for his son and a request that Daniel become her medical advocate. He resisted, until she said that she had lived long enough to know when love was real, and that dignity was not in refusing help, but in accepting it with honesty. When Margaret passed peacefully months later, Daniel stood at her service with his son holding his hand. He realized that the woman denied a table on her birthday had built one anyway, large enough to hold strangers, grief, and hope together. Years later, when Daniel's son asked him why they still celebrated Margaret's birthday every year, Daniel said it was because one moment of compassion had rewritten their lives. Because sometimes, the most powerful changes do not arrive with noise, but with a chair pulled out, a space made, and a quiet decision to see someone fully. That night, Daniel understood that humanity survives not through grand gestures, but through small acts done at the exact moment someone is about to give up. The ripple of that single night continued to move through Daniel's life in ways he could never have predicted. The lessons Margaret left behind didn't fade with grief, but settled into daily choices, shaping the man he became and the father his son watched closely. When Daniel eventually found steadier work managing facilities at a community center, he carried her voice with him, reminding him that people often arrive carrying invisible weight. One winter evening, as he locked up, he noticed a young woman sitting on the steps with nowhere to go. Instead of walking past, he sat beside her, listened, found resources, and made space. Because he had learned that dignity begins with being seen. At home, Margaret's photographs still lined a small shelf, her smile a constant presence. When bills were paid on time for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel triumph so much as responsibility. The trust Margaret had left was not a reward, but a charge to live openly, to extend the table further. When his son asked one evening what kind of man he should grow up to be, Daniel didn't speak about success or strength. He spoke about noticing who is being turned away, about standing up when something feels wrong, about choosing kindness even when it costs something. On the anniversary of Margaret's 80th birthday, they returned to the same restaurant, not in anger, but quietly, ordering dessert, lighting a candle, and sharing stories with the staff who listened with soft expressions. Daniel realized then that what Margaret had given them was not just security, but continuity. A reminder that one compassionate act does not end when the moment passes. It multiplies through time, through people, through choices. As they walked home under the glow of streetlights, his son slipped his hand into Daniel's and said that he hoped no one ever felt alone on their birthday again. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not from fear this time, but from gratitude. The woman who had once been denied a table had taught them how to build one anywhere, and as long as they lived that truth, her presence would never truly leave, living on in every chair offered, every stranger welcomed, and every quiet decision to care, when it would have been easier to turn away. In the quiet months that followed, life did not suddenly become perfect, but it became meaningful. The memory of that night remained a steady compass. When challenges came, Daniel faced them with a calm resolve, born from understanding that dignity is something you protect, not something you earn. His son grew into a young man who carried that lesson naturally, the way values are carried when they are lived instead of preached. One spring afternoon, as they volunteered at a local shelter setting tables for a community meal, Daniel watched strangers sit down, talk, laugh, and feel included. He felt a quiet certainty settle over him, the certainty that Margaret's legacy had taken root far beyond one birthday or one restaurant. Her story had reshaped a family, touched a community, and transformed an ordinary man into someone who knew that small moments can hold immense power. As the evening ended, Daniel and his son walked home side by side, not needing to speak, carrying the unspoken truth that the world changes through brave, compassionate choices made in ordinary moments. Sometimes the most profound gift you can give another human being is simply a place at the table, a moment of recognition, and the reminder that no one should ever have to celebrate life feeling unseen. Because when one person chooses to care, the impact can echo across generations, quietly, enduringly, and forever.